Sign it, Eleanor. It's just a formality, Vanessa said, sliding the document across the polished oak table with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. And in that moment, I realized something that settled into my bones like winter cold. They thought I was weak, but they had no idea I had been watching every move they made. I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I simply adjusted my glasses, glanced down at the paper without really reading it, and nodded as if I trusted her completely. The kitchen smelled faintly of fresh coffee and lemon cleaner, the same way it had for the past 20 years, but something in the air felt different that morning, thinner somehow, like the house itself was holding its breath. Vanessa leaned against the counter, arms crossed lightly, her posture relaxed in a way that suggested she believed the outcome was already decided. My son Daniel stood by the window, staring out at the backyard like he always did when he didn't want to be part of a conversation, his reflection faint in the glass, distant, detached. I noticed the small things. I always noticed the small things. The way Vanessa's fingers tapped twice against her elbow, a habit she had when she was anticipating something. The way Daniel didn't turn around, didn't even glance at me, as if this moment didn't involve him at all. I had spent decades raising that boy, memorizing the sound of his footsteps in the hallway, the tone of his voice when he was tired or worried, and now I couldn't even read him anymore. Or maybe I could, and that was the problem. It'll make things easier for everyone, Vanessa added, her voice soft, measured, carefully kind in the way people are when they've rehearsed their lines. Easier. That word lingered in the air longer than it should have. I folded my hands neatly on the table, feeling the cool surface beneath my fingertips, grounding myself in the quiet. I had learned a long time ago that silence can be more powerful than any argument. People reveal more when they think you've already surrendered. And so I let them think that. I let them believe I was the grieving widow who didn't understand paperwork, the aging mother who needed help managing things, the quiet woman who would sign whatever was placed in front of her because it was easier than making a fuss. I had worn that role well these past few months. Too well. The truth was, ever since my husband passed, I had been paying closer attention than anyone realized. Grief has a way of sharpening your senses. When the house grows quiet, when the days stretch long and empty, you start to notice patterns. Conversations that stop when you enter the room. Phone calls taken just out of earshot. Documents moved from one drawer to another. It starts small. It always does. A misplaced envelope. A changed tone. A look exchanged when they think you're not paying attention. I remember the first time I felt it, that subtle shift. It was a Tuesday morning, nothing remarkable about it. I was standing at the sink, rinsing a coffee mug, when I heard Vanessa's voice from the living room, low and hurried. "No, she hasn't asked any questions," she said, followed by a pause. Then a quiet laugh that didn't sound like anything I'd heard from her before. I didn't step closer. I didn't interrupt. I simply turned off the water and stood there, listening to the silence that followed. That was the moment the first crack appeared. Not loud, not dramatic, just enough to let the light in. Since then, I had been collecting those moments, one by one, like puzzle pieces scattered across a table. The way Daniel started deferring to Vanessa on decisions that used to involve me. The way certain bills stopped arriving in the mail and started appearing in neat stacks on the counter, already opened. The way Vanessa began using phrases like, "What's best for you?" and "We've been thinking," as if my life had quietly become a group project I wasn't fully invited to participate in. I didn't confront them. Not then. Confrontation is messy. It gives people time to adjust their stories, to cover their tracks. No, I chose something else. I chose patience. I chose observation. I chose to let them believe the version of me they had already decided on. And now, sitting at that table, with that document in front of me and Vanessa watching so carefully for my reaction, I understood that whatever they had been planning had finally reached its next step. I picked up the pen slowly, feeling its weight between my fingers, and for a brief second, I caught my reflection. In the dark surface of the window behind Daniel. The woman looking back at me wasn't fragile. She wasn't confused. She wasn't weak. She was calm, deliberate, awake in a way she hadn't been before. I lowered my gaze, letting my expression soften just enough, and signed my name exactly where Vanessa had indicated. She exhaled, almost imperceptibly, but I heard it. Relief, satisfaction, victory, or so she thought. I placed the pen down carefully and slid the paper back toward her, my movement steady, unhurried. "If you think this is best," I said quietly, my voice even, giving nothing away. Vanessa smiled then, a brighter, more genuine smile than I'd seen in weeks, and Daniel finally turned from the window, glancing at the document before looking at me with something that might have been gratitude, or maybe just convenience. It didn't matter. Not anymore. Because what they didn't understand, what they couldn't see, was that this wasn't the moment I lost control. This was the moment I confirmed everything I already suspected. And while they were busy believing I had just handed over my power, I was already taking something far more valuable in return. I was taking the truth, and I was keeping it to myself. For now. The house had never been this quiet before, not even in the first week after my husband passed, when the silence still felt raw and unfamiliar, like a guest that had not yet settled in. But now it had become something else entirely, something that lived in the walls and moved through the rooms with me, subtle and constant, as if it had claimed the space as much as anyone else. I woke early the next morning, long before the sun had fully risen, and lay still for a moment, listening. No footsteps, no voices, just the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the distant sound of a car passing somewhere beyond the neighborhood. I turned my head slightly and looked at the empty side of the bed, the sheets still neatly tucked the way I had left them, untouched, as if preserving something I could not quite name. For a long time, I did not move. There is a kind of clarity that comes in those early hours, when everything is stripped down to its simplest form, and you can see things without distraction. The day before replayed itself in my mind, not as a blur of emotion, but as a series of precise moments, each one carefully placed, each one revealing more than it had at the time. The document, Vanessa's voice, Daniel's silence, my own hand signing my name with a steadiness that had surprised even me. I sat up slowly, placing my feet on the cool hardwood floor, and reached for my robe, wrapping it around me with deliberate care. The house felt larger in the morning, every room stretched by the absence of noise, every surface holding on to memories that no one else seemed to notice anymore. I made my way downstairs, my steps measured, familiar, and paused at the kitchen doorway, taking in the scene as if I were seeing it for the first time. The coffee maker was already set, a small detail Vanessa had insisted on managing since she moved in, something about efficiency and routine, but I had noticed she never actually drank coffee herself. Another small thing, another piece that did not quite fit. I pressed the button and watched as the machine came to life, the slow drip filling the glass pot with a steady rhythm that echoed softly through the room. I did not rush. I had learned that rushing makes people careless, and I had no intention of being careless now. As I waited, I let my eyes move across the kitchen, resting briefly on the drawer near the sink, the one that had been slightly ajar the night before. It was closed now, perfectly aligned, as if nothing had ever been disturbed, but I knew better. I had seen Vanessa open it late in the evening, after she thought I had gone to bed, her movements quiet but not quiet enough. I had heard the soft slide of paper against wood, the faint click as she closed it again. I had not gone down to check. I had not needed to. The knowledge itself was enough. I poured myself a cup of coffee and carried it to the small table by the window, the same place I had sat every morning for years, long before Vanessa entered this house with her careful smiles and practiced concern. Outside, the backyard looked unchanged, the grass trimmed, the old maple tree standing tall at the edge of the fence, its branches swaying slightly in the morning breeze. It was almost comforting, that illusion of normalcy, that sense that some things remained exactly as they had always been. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle, and allowed myself a single, quiet thought. They believed the story they had created. They believed I was no longer paying attention. And that belief was their greatest mistake. I thought about the way Vanessa had watched me sign the document, the way her shoulders had relaxed just enough to betray her confidence, and I realized something that made everything sharper, clearer. She was not just acting. She was certain that I would not question her, certain that Daniel would not intervene, certain that whatever plan they had set in motion would continue exactly as they intended. That kind of certainty does not come from nowhere. It is built over time, reinforced by patterns, by repeated success, by the absence of resistance. Which meant this had not started yesterday. This had not started last week. This had been unfolding for much longer than I had allowed myself to admit. I set the cup down gently and folded my hands in my lap, staring out at the yard, but seeing something else entirely. Moments, conversations, small decisions that had seemed insignificant at the time. The day Vanessa suggested consolidating the household accounts to make things simpler. The afternoon Daniel mentioned that it might be easier if certain documents were kept in one place, where they could be managed more efficiently. The way my access to certain information had gradually shifted, not abruptly, not enough to raise alarm, but just enough to change the balance. Each step had been reasonable on its own. Each change had been presented as helpful, and I had allowed it. Not because I was unaware, but because I had not yet understood the full picture. Now I did. And understanding changes everything. I stood up slowly, carrying my empty cup to the sink, and rinsed it with steady hands. There was no urgency in my movements, no outward sign that anything had shifted, and that was exactly how it needed to be. I would not confront them. Not yet. There was still more to see, more to learn, and I intended to let them show me everything. I dried my hands with a towel and glanced once more toward the drawer, still closed, still quiet, holding whatever secrets Vanessa believed were hidden. I did not open it. Instead, I turned away and walked out of the kitchen, my steps as calm as they had always been, my expression unchanged. Because while they were busy believing the house belonged to them now, believing the decisions were theirs to make, I was beginning to understand something far more important. This house had not become quiet because I was alone. It had become quiet because I was listening. It was just afternoon when the doorbell rang, a single, measured chime that echoed through the quiet house in a way that felt almost deliberate, as if whoever stood on the other side knew exactly how sound carried in a place like this, knew how silence could magnify even the smallest interruption. I did not rush to answer it. I set the dish towel down neatly by the sink, smoothed the front of my blouse, and walked toward the front door at the same steady pace I had maintained all morning. When I opened it, I found a man standing there who did not belong to the rhythm of this house. He was in his early 60s, perhaps, dressed in a navy suit that had seen careful use, not new but well-maintained, his posture upright, his expression polite in a way that suggested he understood both boundaries and the importance of timing. "Mrs. Hayes?" he asked, his voice calm, professional. I nodded once. "Eleanor Hayes." He offered a small, respectful smile. "My name is Robert Klein. I handled some of your husband's legal matters several years ago. I was in the area and thought it might be appropriate to stop by." Appropriate. That word again. It seemed to follow me lately, attaching itself to situations that were anything but. I stepped aside and gestured for him to come in, closing the door behind him with a soft click that seemed louder than it should have been. "I remember your name," I said, leading him toward the sitting room. "You helped us revise the will about 5 years ago." He inclined his head slightly, taking a seat only after I had done the same. "That is correct. Your husband was very thorough." There was a pause, brief but intentional, and I watched him carefully, noting the way his hands rested on his briefcase, not tense, but not entirely relaxed either. He had come for a reason. "I hope you will forgive the intrusion," he continued. "But there is something I felt you should be aware of. Something your husband was quite particular about." I did not respond immediately. I had learned that silence invites more honesty than questions ever could. He opened the briefcase slowly and removed a slim folder, placing it on the table between us without pushing it toward me just yet. "Your husband requested that certain documents remain dormant unless specific conditions arose," he said, choosing his words with care. "I have reason to believe those conditions may now be relevant." The air in the room shifted, not dramatically, but enough for me to feel it. I glanced at the folder, then back at him, my expression unchanged. "What kind of conditions?" I asked quietly. Robert exhaled, not heavily, but with the weight of someone who understood the significance of what he was about to say. "Any situation in which your authority over your own assets or property might be compromised without your full, informed consent." The words settled slowly, each one finding its place. Compromised. Authority. Consent. I felt something align inside me, not surprise, not even shock, but confirmation. A quiet, steady confirmation that the pieces I had been collecting were beginning to form a complete picture. "And what makes you believe that is happening?" I asked, my voice steady, almost neutral. He hesitated for just a fraction of a second, enough for me to notice. I received a call yesterday, he said, from a firm requesting verification of documentation related to a property transfer. The details were unusual. Your name was present, but the structure of the request suggested you may not have been the one initiating it. I thought of the document on the table the day before, the pen in my hand, Vanessa's eyes watching, waiting. I see, I said simply. Robert finally slid the folder toward me, his gaze steady but not intrusive. I believe it would be wise for you to review these, he said. They include provisions your husband added specifically to protect you in situations like this. He was quite clear about his intentions. I placed my hand on the folder but did not open it immediately. Instead, I let my fingers rest there, feeling the weight of it, the quiet certainty contained within something so ordinary. He always was. I murmured, more to myself than to Robert. There was another brief silence, but this one felt different. Not empty. Full. Mrs. Hayes, Robert added gently. If there is anything you do not understand, or if you feel uncertain about any recent decisions, I strongly recommend we discuss them before any further action is taken. I nodded once, finally opening the folder and glancing at the first page, not reading every word, but recognizing enough to understand its purpose. Safeguards. Conditions. Authority clearly defined in a way that could not easily be redirected or assumed by someone else. I closed the folder carefully and looked back at him. Thank you for coming, I said, my voice calm measured. You have been very helpful. He stood, taking that as his cue, and offered a polite nod. It is my responsibility, he replied. Your husband trusted me to ensure you were protected. I intend to honor that. I walked him to the door, watching as he stepped out into the afternoon light, his figure steady, purposeful, before he turned and made his way down the path. When I closed the door, the house returned to its familiar quiet, but it no longer felt the same. I stood there for a moment, the folder still in my hands, and allowed myself a single, silent acknowledgement. They had thought this was already decided. They had believed the outcome was certain, that the pieces were already in place, that I had signed away more than just my name. But now, standing in the stillness of that hallway, with the evidence of my husband's foresight resting quietly against my palm, I understood something they did not. The story they believed they were writing had another author, and I had just been handed the first page. I did not open the folder right away, not because I was afraid of what it might contain, but because I understood something that had taken me years to learn, that timing matters more than information, and that knowledge revealed too soon can be just as dangerous as ignorance. Instead, I carried it with me into the living room and placed it on the side table beside my chair, where it sat quietly, unassuming, like any other stack of papers that had passed through this house over the years. Then I sat down, folded my hands in my lap, and allowed my mind to move backward, not in a rush, not searching frantically for answers, but carefully, deliberately, retracing steps that I had once accepted without question. It is strange how memory works when you finally know what you are looking for. Moments that once felt ordinary begin to shift, their edges sharpening, their meaning changing as if they had been waiting patiently for you to catch up. I thought about the afternoon Vanessa first suggested we reorganize the household documents. She had stood in this very room, smiling, her tone light, almost casual, as she explained how much easier it would be if everything were kept in one place, if bills, statements, and records were streamlined, centralized, simplified. I had agreed. It sounded reasonable, helpful even. At the time, I had seen it as a gesture of support, a daughter-in-law stepping in to ease the burden during a difficult period. Now, sitting there with the quiet weight of the folder beside me, I saw something else entirely. Not a gesture, a beginning. I remembered the way she had taken the files from my hands, one by one, assuring me she would organize them and return them neatly labeled. She had done exactly that. Every folder was pristine, every document in order, every detail accounted for. It had been impressive, efficient, trustworthy, and in that efficiency, something subtle had shifted. Control had changed hands, not abruptly, not enough to raise suspicion, but just enough to alter the balance. I let that thought settle, then moved to the next piece. Daniel, my son, had always been steady, predictable in the way he approached life, cautious with decisions, respectful of boundaries. At least, that was the version of him I had known for most of his life. But in recent months, there had been changes, small at first, almost imperceptible. He began to defer more often, not to me, but to Vanessa. Decisions that once would have included a conversation now seemed to happen elsewhere, quietly, without my input. I had noticed it, of course. A mother always notices. But I had told myself it was natural, that marriage changes dynamics, that it was not my place to question how they managed their lives. That had been true once. It was no longer true now. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my eyes resting on the window across the room, though I was no longer seeing the outside world. I was seeing patterns, connections, the way certain conversations had taken place just out of reach, the way information had begun to flow differently, the way my role in my own home had been adjusted without ever being directly addressed. It had not been forceful. It had not been obvious. That was what made it effective. No confrontation, no resistance, just a gradual shift, carefully managed, carefully maintained. I thought about the drawer in the kitchen, the one I had noticed the night before, and how it had always been a place for miscellaneous items, spare keys, old receipts, things that did not quite belong anywhere else. Recently, however, it had become something more. Vanessa had started using it regularly, opening and closing it with a familiarity that suggested it now served a specific purpose. I had never asked what was inside. I had never needed to. The act itself was enough. People reveal their intentions not only through what they say, but through what they protect. I exhaled slowly, not out of frustration or anger, but out of recognition. The pieces were no longer scattered. They were forming a complete picture, one that was both clearer and more complex than I had initially imagined. This had not been a single decision or a single moment of betrayal. This had been a process, thoughtful, patient, built over time with the kind of precision that only comes from confidence and opportunity. And I had provided both, not because I was unaware, but because I had chosen to trust. That was the part that might have once hurt me, the realization that my trust had been used as a tool, shaped and directed toward an outcome I had not agreed to. But sitting there, in the stillness of that room, I found that the feeling did not rise the way it might have before. There was no sharp edge to it, no immediate reaction, just a quiet understanding. Trust, like anything else, can be recalibrated. I shifted slightly in my seat and finally reached for the folder, opening it this time with steady hands, my eyes moving across the pages with a calm focus that surprised me only slightly. The language was clear, precise, structured in a way that left very little room for interpretation. My husband had anticipated something, perhaps not the exact details, but the possibility. He had known enough to prepare, enough to ensure that if a line was ever crossed, there would be a way to step back from it, to reestablish what belonged to me. I closed the folder again and rested my hand on top of it, feeling the quiet certainty it represented. For the first time since the pieces began to fall into place, I allowed myself a single, simple acknowledgement. This was not a situation that required confrontation. Not yet. This was a situation that required patience, observation, precision. I stood slowly, carrying the folder with me as I moved toward the hallway, my steps measured, my expression unchanged. Somewhere in the house, I heard Vanessa's voice, light, conversational, speaking on the phone as if nothing had shifted, as if everything was proceeding exactly as planned. I paused briefly, listening, not to the words themselves, but to the tone, the rhythm, the confidence that remained intact. Then I continued walking, the folder held securely in my hand, a quiet answer to a question they did not yet realize had been asked. Because while they were still moving forward, certain of their direction, I had already begun to see the path from above. And once you see the whole path, you no longer need to follow it. The rest of the afternoon unfolded exactly as it always did, and that was precisely what made it useful. Vanessa moved through the house with her usual efficiency, opening cabinets, closing drawers, making small adjustments that gave the impression of care but carried the quiet precision of control. Daniel returned home just after 5, his footsteps familiar, measured, but lighter than they had been in the months after his father passed, as if some unseen weight had shifted from his shoulders. I greeted him the same way I always did, with a calm smile and a simple question about his day, and he answered in the same distracted tone, offering just enough detail to appear present without truly engaging. It was a rhythm we had both fallen into, and I allowed it to continue, unchanged, uninterrupted. At dinner, Vanessa placed the plates on the table with careful attention, her movements smooth, practiced, and I noticed the way she glanced at me, not directly, but just enough to gauge my expression, to measure whether anything had shifted since the day before. I gave her nothing. I spoke when spoken to, nodded when appropriate, and kept my voice even, my tone neutral, the same woman they had come to expect. That was the key. Expectation. People rarely question what fits within the pattern they have already accepted. It was after dinner, when the dishes were cleared and the house settled into its usual evening quiet, that the next piece revealed itself. Vanessa excused herself with a brief mention of needing to finish something upstairs, her voice light, casual, but her pace just slightly quicker than usual as she moved toward the hallway. Daniel remained in the living room, flipping through channels without really watching anything, his attention divided, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested he was comfortable with the current arrangement of things. I sat in my chair, hands folded, my gaze resting on the television, but my attention elsewhere. I waited. Not for long. Just enough. Then I stood, moving quietly through the hallway, my steps measured, my presence unnoticed as I reached the base of the staircase. I did not climb it immediately. Instead, I paused, listening. There it was. The faint murmur of Vanessa's voice, lower now, more controlled, speaking in the careful tone of someone who is discussing something that is not meant to be overheard. I took one step upward, then another, placing my foot deliberately on the edge of each stair to avoid the subtle creak I knew too well. The house had its habits. So did I. As I reached the midpoint of the staircase, her words became clearer, not every sentence, not every detail, but enough. She signed it. Vanessa said, her voice carrying just enough satisfaction to confirm what I already knew. There was a pause, then a softer tone, almost amused. No, she did not ask anything. I told you, she trusts me. Trust. The word lingered in the air, heavier now, stripped of its softness, reduced to something functional, something useful. I remained still, my hand resting lightly on the banister, my breathing steady, my presence undetected. We can move forward, she continued, her voice now more focused, more direct. Yes, everything is in place. The next step will be simple. Simple. Another word that had been repeated often enough to lose its meaning, until now. I did not need to hear the rest. I did not need to know every detail of the plan she was discussing. What I needed, I had already received. Confirmation. Not suspicion. Not interpretation. Confirmation. I turned slowly, retracing my steps down the staircase with the same care I had used to ascend, each movement controlled, each sound measured. By the time I returned to the living room, Daniel had not looked up, his attention still fixed on the screen, unaware of anything beyond the surface of the evening. I resumed my seat, my posture unchanged, my expression calm, and allowed the quiet to settle once more. Inside, however, something had shifted, not abruptly, not violently, but with the quiet certainty of a decision fully formed. They were no longer preparing. They were executing. And that meant I was no longer observing a possibility. I was observing a plan in motion. I folded my hands once more, feeling the familiar steadiness return, the clarity that comes when uncertainty is replaced with understanding. There was no need to confront Vanessa. Not now. There was no need to question Daniel, to search for explanations that would only complicate what had already become clear. Instead, I would do what I had been doing from the beginning. I would continue to watch. I would continue to listen. But now, I would also begin to act. Quietly. Precisely, without disrupting the pattern they had come to rely on. Because the most effective changes are the ones no one sees coming. A few minutes later, Vanessa's footsteps descended the stairs, light, composed, her expression unchanged as she re-entered the room. She smiled briefly in my direction, a gesture so practiced it almost appeared genuine. I returned the smile, just as practiced, just as measured. And in that brief exchange, nothing appeared different. Nothing appeared out of place. But beneath that surface, something had already been set in motion. They believed they were moving forward without resistance, that each step brought them closer to an outcome they had already decided. What they did not understand was that every step they took was now being recorded, not on paper, not in a file, but in something far more reliable. My memory. And I never forget the moments that matter. The next morning, I woke with a clarity that felt almost unfamiliar, not because it was new, but because I had not allowed myself to fully embrace it until now. And as I sat at the edge of the bed, looking out at the soft gray light settling over the yard, I understood that everything moving forward would depend not on what I revealed, but on what I chose to conceal. I dressed slowly, deliberately, selecting the same kind of simple outfit I had worn for years, nothing that would draw attention, nothing that would suggest a shift in mood or intention. And when I made my way downstairs, I found Vanessa already in the kitchen, standing at the counter with her phone in hand, her expression composed, her tone light as she spoke to someone on the other end. She glanced up briefly when I entered, offering a small smile that I returned without hesitation, and in that exchange, the performance continued exactly as it had the day before. "Good morning," she said, her voice warm, measured, as if nothing in the world required urgency. "I made coffee." I nodded, moving to the cabinet for a mug, my movements unhurried, my presence steady. "Thank you," I replied, my tone even, giving her exactly what she expected. That was the balance I needed to maintain. Not too distant, not too engaged, just enough to remain within the version of me they believed they understood. As I poured the coffee, I noticed the folder from the previous day had been moved, not taken, not hidden, but repositioned slightly on the side table where I had left it, angled just enough to suggest it had been examined, even if only briefly. I did not acknowledge it. I did not look at it for more than a second. Instead, I carried my cup to the table by the window and sat down, allowing the silence to settle naturally around us. Vanessa ended her call a few moments later and joined me, her posture relaxed, her demeanor controlled in a way that had become increasingly familiar. "I was thinking," she began, stirring her tea though she had not added anything to it. "It might be a good idea to start organizing some of the larger decisions now, just to make things easier down the line." I nodded slightly, taking a sip of coffee before responding, giving the impression that I was considering her suggestion carefully. "If you think that is best," I said, my voice soft, agreeable, exactly what she wanted to hear. She smiled, and this time the satisfaction was more visible, less restrained, as if each confirmation strengthened her certainty. "I just want to make sure everything is taken care of properly," she added. Properly. Another word that had been used often enough to mask its true purpose. I let the conversation end there, not offering more, not asking questions, allowing her to fill the silence if she chose, but she did not. She did not need to. In her mind, everything was already moving as planned. After breakfast, Daniel left for work with his usual brief farewell, his attention divided, his mind elsewhere, and Vanessa moved upstairs soon after, mentioning something about paperwork that needed to be reviewed. I remained in the kitchen for a few minutes longer, rinsing my cup, drying it carefully, placing it back in the cabinet with the same precision I had used for years. Routine was important. It created a sense of continuity, a framework that others relied on to measure change. And as long as that framework remained intact, any shift happening beneath it would go unnoticed. Once I was alone, I moved quietly to the living room and retrieved the folder, carrying it with me to the small desk near the hallway where I had once kept my own records, before they had gradually been relocated under Vanessa's careful supervision. I opened it again, this time reading more closely, allowing each line to settle, each clause to reveal its purpose. It was all there, clear, direct, unambiguous. My authority had not been removed. It had not been transferred. It had only been assumed by someone who believed I would not challenge it. That distinction mattered. It changed everything. I closed the folder and sat still for a moment, letting the weight of that understanding anchor itself fully. There was no need to rush. No need to react impulsively. The situation was not out of control. It had simply been misrepresented. And misrepresentation, once recognized, can be corrected. The key was to do so without disrupting the illusion they had built. I stood, placing the folder back exactly where it had been, aligning it precisely with the edge of the table, restoring the scene to its expected state. Then I moved toward the hallway, pausing briefly at the base of the staircase, listening. The faint sound of Vanessa's footsteps above, steady, confident, unaware. I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible breath, not of relief, but of readiness. From this point forward, every action I took would be intentional, every word measured, every silence purposeful. I would continue to agree when agreement was expected, I would continue to comply when compliance was assumed. But beneath that surface, something else would be unfolding. Quietly, carefully, without warning. Because the most effective strategy is not to resist what others expect of you, but to use it. And they expected me to be weak. So I would be exactly that. Until it was time not to be. That afternoon, I left the house for the first time in several days. Not with urgency, not with any visible purpose, but with the quiet intention of someone maintaining routine. And that was exactly how it needed to appear. I informed Vanessa before I left, mentioning casually that I had a small errand to run. Something vague, something unremarkable, and she responded with a polite nod, her attention already returning to the papers spread across the dining table, as if my absence held no significance at all. That was good. The less importance she placed on my movements, the more freedom I had within them. The drive felt familiar, the streets unchanged, the same intersections, the same quiet corners of the neighborhood that had remained constant for years, and yet everything felt slightly sharper now, more defined, as if I was seeing the world not through habit, but through intention. I parked a few blocks away from the office, choosing a spot that required a short walk, giving myself time to settle, to ensure that every step I took from this point forward was deliberate. When I entered the building, the air was cool, controlled, carrying the faint scent of polished wood and paper, a place where decisions were made quietly, but carried weight far beyond the room itself. Robert Klein greeted me with the same composed professionalism as before, though this time there was a subtle shift in his expression, something more attentive, as if he understood that my presence here was not casual. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, standing as I approached. "I was hoping you might come in." I offered a small, polite smile and took the seat across from his desk, placing my hands neatly in my lap, my posture relaxed, my voice steady when I spoke. "I reviewed the documents," I said. "I believe I understand their purpose." He nodded, watching me carefully, not interrupting, allowing me to continue at my own pace. That was another reason I had chosen him. He understood silence. "I would like to ensure that everything is aligned," I added, choosing the word deliberately, letting it carry its own meaning without needing to explain further. Robert leaned back slightly, his hands resting together as he considered my words. "Of course," he replied. "And have there been any recent developments that concern you?" I paused, just long enough to acknowledge the question without rushing to answer it. "There have been assumptions made," I said finally, my tone even, my expression unchanged. "Assumptions about authority, about consent." His gaze sharpened slightly, though his demeanor remained controlled. "I see," he said. "And you would like to clarify those assumptions before they are acted upon further." "Yes," I replied simply. He reached for a notepad, jotting down a few brief notes, his movements precise, efficient. "In that case, I would recommend we take a few precautionary steps," he said. "Nothing that would disrupt the current situation, but enough to ensure that any decisions made moving forward require your direct involvement." That was exactly what I needed. Not disruption, not confrontation. Adjustment. Quiet, controlled adjustment that would shift the structure without drawing attention to the change. "What would that involve?" I asked. Robert explained the process in clear, measured terms, outlining the steps needed to reinforce the protections already in place, to ensure that no transfer, no decision, no movement of assets could occur without my explicit authorization. It was not complicated. That was the most important part. Complexity creates noise. Simplicity moves unnoticed. I listened carefully, asking only the questions that mattered, confirming only what needed to be confirmed, and when he finished, I nodded once, my decision already made. "Let us proceed," I said. There was no hesitation in my voice, no uncertainty in my expression, and I noticed the way Robert regarded me for a brief moment, as if reassessing something he had initially assumed. Perhaps he had expected hesitation. Perhaps he had expected confusion. He found neither. The paperwork was straightforward, each page clear, each signature required placed exactly where it needed to be, and as I signed, my hand remained steady, not because I was unaware of the significance, but because I was fully aware of it. This was not a reaction. This was preparation. When everything was complete, Robert gathered the documents neatly, placing them into a secure folder with the same care I had seen him use before. "These measures will not be visible to anyone reviewing the current arrangements," he said. but they will ensure that any further actions require your direct confirmation. I inclined my head slightly. That is exactly what I intended. I stood, smoothing my jacket, my movements calm, controlled, and extended my hand briefly in acknowledgement. Thank you, Mr. Klein. He shook my hand with quiet respect. It is my responsibility, he replied. And your foresight. I did not correct him. I did not explain. Some things are better left unspoken. When I stepped back outside, the afternoon light felt unchanged, the world continuing exactly as it had before, unaware of the adjustment that had just taken place within it. I walked back to my car at the same measured pace, my expression neutral, my posture relaxed, carrying nothing that would suggest anything had shifted. Because outwardly, nothing had. That was the point. By the time I returned home, Vanessa was still at the table, her papers arranged in neat stacks, her attention focused, her confidence intact. She glanced up as I entered, offering a brief smile. Everything all right? She asked, her tone light, unconcerned. I returned the smile just as easily, setting my purse down with the same quiet familiarity as always. Yes, I said. Everything is exactly as it should be. And for the first time since this began, that was no longer something she could assume. It was something I had ensured. It happened 3 days later, in the quiet, ordinary way that most important moments do, without warning, without announcement, and yet with a weight that made everything feel slightly more precise, slightly more defined. Vanessa had spent the morning on the phone, her voice controlled, her tone carrying that same careful confidence I had come to recognize, and by the time Daniel returned home early that afternoon, something in the air had already shifted. We should sit down together, Vanessa said as he stepped into the living room, her words directed at both of us, though her eyes flickered toward me for just a fraction of a second, measuring, confirming. I looked up from my chair, setting aside the book I had not been reading, and nodded gently. Of course, I replied, my voice calm, my expression unchanged. The three of us gathered at the dining table, the same place where I had signed the document days earlier, the same polished surface reflecting the soft afternoon light, the same arrangement that had become so familiar it almost felt routine. Vanessa placed a folder in front of her, not the same one I had received, but similar in appearance, similar in intention, and I noticed the way her fingers rested lightly on top of it, as if anchoring something she believed was already hers. Daniel sat beside her, his posture slightly tense, though he tried to mask it with a neutral expression, his hands clasped together in a way that suggested he was bracing for something he did not fully understand. We have been reviewing a few things, Vanessa began, her tone smooth, deliberate, and we think it is time to move forward with the next step. Next step. The phrase settled between us, quiet but deliberate, carrying more meaning than she intended to explain. I nodded once, encouraging her to continue, giving her the space she expected. The property transfer we discussed, she added, opening the folder and sliding a set of documents toward me. This will finalize everything. It is mostly procedural at this point. Procedural. Another word designed to reduce significance, to make something substantial feel routine, manageable, unquestionable. I looked down at the papers, not reading them immediately, not reacting, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to feel natural. Then I lifted my gaze, meeting hers briefly before turning to Daniel. And you agree with this? I asked, my voice steady, neutral, not accusatory, not emotional, simply direct. He hesitated, just for a moment, his eyes shifting between Vanessa and me before settling somewhere in between. It just makes things easier, he said, echoing the same language she had used before, the same justification, the same quiet deflection. Easier. I nodded slowly, as if considering his answer, as if weighing something that had not already been decided. I see, I said softly. Vanessa leaned forward slightly, her expression reassuring, her tone gentle. We just want to make sure everything is handled properly, she added. Properly. Always properly. I placed my hands lightly on the edge of the table, feeling the familiar surface beneath my fingertips, grounding myself in the moment, in the clarity I had already established. Then, without raising my voice, without changing my tone, I spoke. I reviewed the previous documents more carefully. I said, my words calm, measured, carrying no hint of confrontation, only quiet certainty. Vanessa's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough for me to notice. A slight tightening around the eyes. A brief pause in her breathing. And I also spoke with Robert Klein. I continued, watching the way her posture adjusted, the way her fingers pressed more firmly against the folder in front of her. That was the moment. Not loud, not explosive, just a shift. A single adjustment in the balance that had been building beneath the surface. He helped clarify a few things. I added, my voice steady, my gaze returning to the documents in front of me before lifting again to meet hers. About authority. About consent. Daniel's brow furrowed slightly, confusion beginning to replace his earlier detachment, while Vanessa remained still, her expression composed, though the confidence beneath it had begun to fracture. I believe there has been a misunderstanding, I said, not accusing, not raising the temperature of the room, simply stating what had already become clear. These decisions are not procedural. They require my direct approval. Every step. The silence that followed was different from the ones before. This one carried weight. Recognition. The quiet realization that something had shifted in a way that could not be easily redirected. Vanessa's smile returned, but it was different now, more controlled, less certain. Of course, she said, her tone carefully measured. That is what we are doing. We are asking for your approval. I nodded slightly, acknowledging her words without fully accepting them. Then I will take the time to review everything properly. I replied, my voice calm, final in a way that did not require emphasis. I gathered the documents, aligning them neatly, my movements unhurried, deliberate, and stood from the table with the same quiet composure I had maintained throughout. No raised voices. No confrontation. No visible conflict. And yet, everything had changed. Because in that moment, the certainty they had relied on was no longer theirs. It had shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough. Enough to alter the direction of every step that would follow. The house felt different that evening, not because anything had visibly changed, but because something unseen had shifted its place within it, like a weight that had been quietly moved from one side of a scale to the other, altering the balance in a way only I could feel. Vanessa remained at the table long after I left, her voice low as she spoke to Daniel, their words indistinct from the hallway, but their tone unmistakable. There was no longer the same ease, the same quiet certainty that had filled their conversations before. Something had interrupted it, not broken it, not yet, but disrupted it enough to make them pause, to reconsider, to adjust. I did not return to the dining room. Instead, I walked to my bedroom, closing the door behind me with the same gentle care I had used for years, and set the documents on the dresser, aligning them neatly, as I had done with everything else in my life. Order had always been important to me. Not control, not dominance, just clarity, the kind that allows you to see where things truly stand. I sat on the edge of the bed and allowed the silence to settle around me. Not heavy, not oppressive, but steady, like something that had finally found its proper place. For a long time, I had mistaken stillness for weakness. I had believed that quiet meant absence, that restraint meant surrender. But now I understood something different. Stillness is not the absence of action. It is the space where action becomes precise. I reached for the documents and opened them again, reading slowly, not searching for anything new, but confirming what I already knew. Every line, every condition, every boundary that had been set long before this moment. My husband had not been a man of grand gestures, but he had been a man of foresight, and in that foresight, he had left me something far more valuable than comfort. He had left me clarity. I closed the folder and placed it back on the dresser, then stood and walked to the window, looking out at the backyard where the light had begun to fade, the familiar shape of the maple tree casting long shadows across the grass. It was the same view I had seen for decades, unchanged in its appearance, but entirely different in its meaning. Behind me, I heard the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway, followed by a brief pause outside my door. Vanessa, I did not turn. I did not speak. I simply waited. After a moment, there was a soft knock. Eleanor, her voice came, carefully composed, carrying that same measured calm she had used before, though now it felt more deliberate, more cautious. Do you have a moment? I allowed a small pause before responding, just enough to acknowledge the request without rushing to meet it. Of course, I said finally, my tone even. She entered slowly, her posture controlled, her expression polite but more guarded than it had been earlier, as if she was recalibrating, adjusting to a version of me she had not fully anticipated. "I just wanted to make sure everything is clear," she began, her words chosen carefully, each one placed with intention. "We are all on the same page moving forward." I turned then, meeting her gaze directly, not with confrontation, not with hostility, but with a calm steadiness that did not invite interpretation. "Clarity is important," I replied. "That is why I will be reviewing everything thoroughly before making any decisions." She held my gaze for a moment longer than usual, searching, perhaps, for uncertainty, for hesitation, for any sign that she could still guide the outcome in the direction she had planned. She found none. "Of course," she said again, though this time the words carried less confidence, more calculation. She nodded once, then turned and left the room, closing the door quietly behind her. I remained where I was, looking at the closed door for a moment before returning my attention to the window, to the fading light, to the quiet that had settled once more. Downstairs, I could hear Daniel's footsteps, slower now, less certain, as if he too was beginning to feel the shift, though he could not yet define it. That was the nature of change. It does not announce itself. It reveals itself slowly, through absence, through hesitation, through the quiet realization that something no longer fits the way it once did. I exhaled softly, not out of relief, but out of recognition. This was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something else. Not a confrontation, not a conflict, a correction, a return to balance. I turned away from the window and moved toward the dresser, resting my hand briefly on the folder, feeling the steady presence of what it represented. They had believed they were moving forward without resistance, that each step brought them closer to an outcome they had already secured. But they had mistaken silence for surrender. They had mistaken patience for weakness. And now, as the house settled into the quiet rhythm of the evening, I understood something with absolute clarity. I had never lost control. I had simply allowed them to believe that I had. And that belief would be the one thing they would not be able to recover from.